But this part of the conversation, I really wanted to talk to you a little bit about your newest book that just came out, Yogi, of course, about Yogi Berra. Your typical thoroughness was brought to this book as well. Over 100 interviews to really get a story about one of the most storied players in baseball history. And I just wanted to know, like, what you're a New Yorker, you're a Yankee fan. I get the feeling I might know where this is going, but what inspired this book?
A couple of things. One, he was my father's favorite player. And when I was looking to do my next book, I wanted to stay in baseball. Yogi came to mind. My father always told me about a player who dominated the much of the 50s, who was an incredibly dynamic player on the field. I caught Yogi when I was in 1960. Was my real first memories of baseball, and by then Yogi was a very good role-playing outfielder for the Yankees.
A heck of a year for a Yankees fan to get to really.
Oh yeah. The end of that season was shattering, and so getting to I really wanted to dig in and see and feel and learn more about the player that my father saw, not the one that I saw. And I also thought that Yogi's persona really overshadowed his baseball career. And there's been a lot written about Yogi, but a lot of it centered on Yogiisms. A lot of it centered on almost a caricature of him. And while everyone knows that he was a 10-time World Series winner, just how great of a player got lost. So there was so much more of the story out there that I thought that had been told. So I decided that would be my next adventure. It was supposed to take 2.5 years. It took 4.5 years. As you said, there was about 150 people that I spoke with for that. And there are certain people that you find when you do a book that you decide these people are going to be my guides. And I found, usually for a book of this depth and this scope, I was looking for a good 10 to 12 people who, when I met them and understood that they would be the people that would really help me, like Carmen Berra's sister, Bonnie Morse, who still lives in St. Louis, who met Yogi in 1947 and knew him all the rest of his life and went through all the things that they went through. She was phenomenal. And so finding those people really gave me an understanding of who Yogi was that I couldn't find in books and articles about him.
Right. And, what I find interesting sometimes is that, you look at players like, Yogi Berra, for example. Mickey Mantle's another one that I use as an example of. When there's so much out there, just a general material, you know what I mean? And like you said, whether it's the personality, whether it's the on the field performance, anything like that, in Yogi's case in particular, I almost kind of put him on this sort of Babe Ruthian type of category where there's so much lore about him out there. Did you have any issues sort of sifting through that to get to the fact from fiction, I guess is a better way to put it?
That was, the two of the biggest challenges was, one, we're talking about a man who led an incredibly full life, right to his final days. But he was 90 years old when he passed in 2015. Finding people who knew him as a kid, which I did, that was a challenge. Finding baseball players who played against him who were still alive, that was a challenge. There are some, and I found them, and we had some great conversations about what it was like. Also, especially especially with Yogi, there are so many versions of the same story. Some of them often told by Yogi himself. who would tell the story one way here and in a completely different way there. But a lot of sports writers and writers, I mean, a lot of people have taken swings at his life, and there are multiple versions of almost every story, and trying to get at, okay, so which version is, I mean, there are probably 5 versions of where and how he asked Carmen to marry him.
Oh my goodness.
Thankfully, I had Bonnie, who was, around and knew, but, I mean, Yogi and Carmen told a story about him proposing in a restaurant. He proposed in the basement of his house in St. Louis, not at a restaurant. And so, yes, it was a huge challenge to sift through everything. And I think that certainly, it was one of the reasons I told my editors that it was going to take a little more than the 2.5 years that we had planned to get through all of the different versions and decide which one is the right one.
Was there a point where you ended up having to backtrack? Was there a point where you had you had a chapter assembled, and then you interview someone and whatever they said just totally throws it out the window?
Well, I'll tell you, that did happen in my first book. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I learned from doing that was not to start writing before I was done. I mean, done and saying, okay, we're done. Not that I didn't, make phone calls and say, okay, let's go through this one more time and so on and so forth. But I waited until I was confident that I had the story. And, I tried to let the story, I was in it for a long time, and it's easy to say and not as easy to do, is to let the story come to you. It's like, you go in. I mean, I'm a Yankee fan. I know who Yogi Berra is. Most Americans have an idea of who Yogi Berra is. But it's like, okay, let's, keep an open mind and say, a lot of stories could be different. One of the best stories that was told to me was by Red Schoendienst, who's the, Hall of Fame second baseman for the Cardinals and the Pirates. And it was about how Yogi Berra ends up with the New York Yankees and not the St. Louis Cardinals. And he told me about an open tryout, which is the way they used back in the old days. Teams would put a notice in the paper, open tryout for the St. Louis Cardinals at Sportsman Park on this day.
Can you imagine?
And people would come in and try out, and people would get signed. Not so many made it to major leagues, but that was something that was routinely done. So they're this is in 1942, 41, and Schoendienst said that, and he was from Illinois, across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, and that there were literally thousands of kids who came and so they split it into 2 days. Long story short, out of thousands of kids, they get it down to 8. And the 8 were 5 people he didn't remember: Red, Joe Garagiola, who was Yogi's across the street neighbor from the time Yogi was 5 and Joe was 4, and Yogi Berra. And they're driving to a park, Forest Park in St. Louis, and for a tryout just for Branch Rickey, who was the designer of the farm system, thought to be the greatest talent judge of all time. And they watched the 8 players play, and when Yogi came to bat, Red said, "I was the one who pitched it. I never heard the ball hit the bat the way it did with this guy. I never heard it before then. I never heard it, in all my years in Red." It was 93 when I talked to him. He was a special coach with the Cardinals when we talked to Sportsman Park. And he thought he was the best hitter he ever saw. Long story short, Branch Rickey decides that Joe Garagiola is the better catcher and gives him a $500 bonus. And he will only give Yogi half of that. And Yogi says no. And he told Yogi to his face that, "I'm telling you this for your own good. I think you're only a AAA player, and we're looking for players to go all the way." Oof. And that's why Yogi Berra was not a Cardinal. In their infinite wisdom, the St. Louis Browns, who became the Baltimore Orioles, thought, well, if Branch Rickey doesn't like him, we'll sign him, but we're not giving him any money. So that didn't happen. He played American Legion ball for 2 years. That's where he got the nickname Yogi, was by a teammate there. And at the end of her second season, the guy who ran the program knew George Weiss, the general manager of the Yankees, sent him a telegram and says, I have a kid who does everything wrong, but everything turns out right. Pay him $500 bonus, pay him anything you want, for during the season, and he's yours. And that's how he ends up with the New York Yankees.
Wow. So, one of the things that always fascinates me is that for a guy with such coverage, if you will, a guy that has so much exposure in the history of the game, he's still a guy that you kind of like need to go back and look at like his baseball reference page to sort of really get a
how
feel
great he really was.
How great he really was. Was there one thing that in your mind that stands out about his game over anything else? Maybe something obvious. Maybe, I know he was a great defensive catcher. Was there something about him that made you think this guy is on another planet from everyone else statistically?
Okay, well, here's the deal. Most people think that it went from Joe DiMaggio to Mickey Mantle.
Mm-hmm.
It went from Joe DiMaggio to Yogi Berra to Mickey Mantle. And Yogi Berra was the best player on the best team in baseball history. The 1949 to 1953 Yankees won 5 straight World Series. Mm-hmm. Hadn't been done before, hasn't been done since. And it was the end of DiMaggio's career. He was hurt for one of those 3 years. He hit .263 in his final season, nowhere near the player he had been. Mickey Mantle comes up in 1951, and for the first 4 or 5 years, he's striking out as much as he's hitting, and he's getting booed unmercifully by the fans. Yogi Berra is hitting 20-plus home runs a year, knocking in 100 runs a year, batting .280 to .320, catching 141 games a season on average. In 1 year, he caught 149 of 154. Another year, he caught 148 out of 154 games, and he would catch 20 to 22 double headers a year. He would catch back-to-back double headers in August and in September. And Casey Stengel, who was his manager during that stretch, the writers asked him, why do you catch Yogi so much? Because they had good backup catchers. They had guys who they traded away who ended up being all-stars, Gus Triandos, Sherm Lawler, and Casey said, well, when I catch Mr. Berra, we win World Series.